Welcome to Humanities 1900, winter semester 2020 at OCC. This is Introduction to Film, lecture number 2 on genre. So in my last video, I talked about defining genre, thinking about the kind of 3 major categories of film and how genres and subgenres fit into those 3 categories of film, thinking about kind of how genre is developed socially through kind of shared understandings of the way that film works. And in this video, I wanted to get into some more specifics about different uses of genre and also about conventions and iconography as 2 different ways to provide evidence that something sort of fits into or doesn't fit into a particular genre. So genre is a determining factor in which films get made and which don't. In my last video, I talked a little bit about genre cycles, right? The changing popularity in particular genres over time, where you might have a period of 5 or 10 years where you get dozens and dozens of Western films in theaters constantly, right? This is the kind of upswing of the genre cycle. And then the films aren't as popular anymore and you get fewer and fewer. And then, maybe there's a cycle where they become popular again for a brief period sometime later, a couple decades later. So genres move in cycles. And because genres move in cycles, it can be a determining factor in which films get made and which don't, right? So big budget superhero films are far more likely to get greenlit and made now than they would have been in maybe the 1970s or 80s. A Western is less likely to. A war movie is less likely to. A melodrama is less likely to. That doesn't mean that those types of films are never made anymore. They obviously are, but they're made less often, right? So genre can determine which types of films are popular in terms of which types of films get made and people see. So they really kind of dictates popularity as well. Genre can also help us as viewers make easy determinations about what types of films they want to watch. So if I asked you what genres of films do you like, you'd probably have a pretty ready-made answer for me, or you could think about it briefly and say like, well, I guess I watch a lot of true crime, or oh, I like horror, or I hate romantic comedies, right? You might have a sense of what types of movies you enjoy watching based on your mood or based on your personal preferences. So it's a shorthand. It's a way that we can kind of develop an understanding of our preferences using this kind of shorthand language of what a genre is. But the important thing to keep in mind is that genre is really best used to describe films and analyze films rather than to evaluate them. So I'll go ahead and say something controversial. There's no such thing as a bad genre. Maybe there are genres of films that you personally don't prefer, that you don't enjoy as much, but something is not a bad film based on it being a particular genre or subgenres. All genres and subgenres of films have their high points and their low points. Even if, let's say, you personally don't enjoy horror films, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single horror film is a bad film because it's a horror film. It's just not necessarily your personal preference in film. You can describe a film based on its genre. You can analyze a film and what it's doing based on its genre, but let's try not to evaluate films or judge them based on their genre. Like I said, genre changes over time. It evolves. It's not constant. It's shifting underneath us constantly. So using it as a way to kind of decide which films are good or bad or worth watching or not worth watching is not probably the best way to utilize genre. As a way to think through things, right? It's better to think through, how can I analyze this film based on the genre that it fits into, or that maybe it doesn't fit into as well. So the next step is to start thinking about how we can tell a film is in a particular genre, or how you might be able to argue that a film fits into a particular genre. Like I mentioned in my last video, this is not set in stone, and people constantly argue about how you might categorize particular films. Oh, I don't think that that's a slasher film at all. I actually think it's this thing, right? So that's a constant conversation that people have because genre is not set in stone, because it's sort of socially dictated and constantly evolving. Now, there's always a tension between these 2 things, right? Between adhering to conventions and iconography, following the standards, doing what people expect of you, and innovating or changing or evolving with the times. Now, those 2 things are clashing with each other constantly, but we're going to start with the traditions. with the conventions, right? So if we start with conventions, then we can start to think about a little bit later, how do people play with those, toy with those, throw them away entirely? Now, genre conventions are rules by which the narrative of a genre film are governed. And I say rules in quotation marks because they're not hard and fast rules. They're not laws, right? You don't have to follow them. But there's a set of conventions that are standardized in a particular genre film. This thing is likely to happen. This thing will follow this other thing. Now, conventions themselves change and are subverted over time. So what is standard? What is normal in a horror film in 2018, for example, is going to look very, very different than what was standard or what was normal in a horror film in 1942. Right? The conventions have changed over time. There was kind of a set of rules and expectations for horror films in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s. And likely the horror films of the 2030s will look different too, because those conventions change over time. Now, shared genre conventions are what give a group of films a common identity or a family resemblance. If you take a group of horror films, you put them all together, they're going to look like cousins, right? They're going to have similar features and characteristics where you can say, yeah, I can kind of see how these are related to each other. They look similar. They have a family resemblance. Those shared conventions, those are how we know that something is a rom-com, is a zombie film, is true crime. We can tell because there's a family resemblance. Now, films in any given category will follow some, but usually not all of the conventions of a genre. So if there's a list of 10 things that every horror film tends to do, that doesn't mean that every horror film does all 10 of those things all the time, right? Films would be incredibly boring if they always played by the rules, right? So most films do not follow every single standardization or convention or norm of a particular genre. They kind of pick and choose. But they follow enough of the conventions where if you put it next to another film of the same type, you can say, yes, these two are the same thing, right? They're the same basic category. Now, conventions specifically apply to things like story formulas, themes or motifs, character types, the stars, the actors that show up, the settings, the presentation, the form, right? So conventions specifically apply to these things. What types of stories are being told? What are the themes of those stories? What types of characters? Who is playing those characters? What settings do they take place in? And what does it look like, right? You're going to get those are, what's the presentation or form, right? Now, we're going to get more into visuals, though, here in a second when we talk about iconography. Now, iconography is kind of like a convention, but it specifically refers to visual symbols only. So if conventions are the rules, the unwritten rules about story, about character, about plot, about cause and effect, iconography are the unwritten rules about what a film looks like. So visual symbols that share meaning across a group of films. The study of those icons is called iconography. Something is iconic if you can recognize it and you can connect it to its type, right? So iconography is the study of icons that make sense and share meaning across multiple films. Now, iconography is historically specific, and icons do change over time as societal norms and expectations change. Some icons last a very long time, some are kind of more flash in the pan, immediate, but the point is that you can recognize them and you can tie them to a particular place and time. Icons and iconography have a lot of symbolic or connotative power because they can communicate a lot of information quickly and efficiently. So iconography, these would be examples like costumes, right? Like props, like symbols, anything that you can see on the screen that is a visual representation of the genre that you can connect to other types of films within that genre as well. So I'm going to give some examples of how iconography and conventions work. right now, the thing to remember is that conventions and iconographies are both related to rules, right? The unstated, unwritten rules of a particular genre. Conventions are about storytelling and characters. Iconography is about visual symbols, specifically costumes, props, things like that, right? So conventions, iconography, I'll come back to in my next video. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention here, excuse me, about genre is the idea of genre and cultural instrumentalities. Now, by cultural instrumentalities, I mean frameworks for thinking about genre films. So there's kind of 5 different ways that you can think or framework how genre works, right? So because we know that genre can be used to track sociocultural and political shifts over time, that means we have to think a little bit about how do you actually do that work, right? How do you use genre as a way to think about societal and historical changes? Genres reveal a great deal about the society that created and popularized them. If you look at the popularity, for example, of war films, when were war films popular? How has that genre changed over time? Do war films promote war? Do they make war look masculine? Do they make war look heroic? Or do they critique war? Do they make war look incredibly violent and pointless, right? Think about what a war movie from the 1940s during World War II looks like compared to a film post-Vietnam. War films have changed a lot over time. And thinking about how those changes work gives us a really strong sense of how United States kind of nationalism and militarism have changed over time too. That's the idea of a cultural instrumentality, that you can use genre. You can take a specific genre like the war film, and you can think about what a war film looked like 60 years ago, what it looked like 30 years ago, what it looks like today, and it tells you a great deal about our society because we create and consume these stories, right? It tells us more about ourselves. So 5 different ways to understand genre. 1, you can understand film as a reflection of our social attitudes. Film tells us things about ourselves. It's a mirror. You can think about film, number 2, as a producer or a creator of ideology. Rather than reflecting what's already there, it actually creates our understanding of the world around us, right? It doesn't just reflect, but creates. Number 3, film is repressed or hidden meanings. That film shows the things that we don't know about ourselves that are hiding kind of deep down inside, right? Underneath the superego and the ego, way down into the id, into the lizard brain, the worst kind of darkest parts of humanity. Film shows us all that. It reveals all of that, right? 4, film is a relationship between the viewer and the text. It's not just what we have inside of us or what the text is showing us, but it's a combination of those things, right? It's showing us something and we're understanding something and we meet in the middle. There's a relationship between me and the screen and what I see on the screen. And then the last one, 5, is that film is a network of meaning, right? Film is an intertextual, networked conglomeration of different meanings. So it's not just what I see and what the film tells me, but that is networked in with societal expectations, with history, with evolution, with how the people around me respond to things, with what I've read, with what I've heard, with what I've seen. And it's this really complex web of relationships. So do films just reflect what we already think? Do they produce our thoughts for us? Do they uncover hidden thoughts? Is it a relationship between me and the screen? Or is it a relationship between me, the screen, society, and everything else, right? It's 5 different ways or frameworks for thinking about genre. So for example, if I asked you, what does the popularity of superhero films tell us about American society? You could think about one of these cultural instrumentalities and tell me a little bit more about what sort of hidden or repressed meanings do you find in a superhero film, for example? Or how does the superhero film reflect our current attitudes about nationalism or about masculinity or about social justice or whatever topic it is that you're particularly interested in thinking about? So cultural instrumentalities are just a way to think through genre and to think about how genre and film work together, right, to kind of create and purvey certain ideas. So I'm going to stop this video for here. I'm going to come back with a short video on conventions and iconography to give you specific examples from a particular genre, hoping that that will kind of help clarify a little bit what a convention looks like and what iconography looks like.